Recording now, Malia. Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome from the FASSTEST team. I'm Steffi Sinclair. I'm the director of FASSTEST, and I'm really pleased that Tracey Elder and Cathy Schofield are going to present an event on survey methods, because I think surveys, a lot of project teams have approached us over the years with questions about how to design a good survey, and I do think an event like this, a training event, is really needed. I think it's really helpful. Both Tracey and Cathy are in psychology and counselling. So Tracey used to be our scholarship lead in the School of Psychology and Counselling, and has very recently left us and handed over the baton to Cathy, who's our brand new scholarship lead in the Psychology and Counselling School. And yeah, thank you very much to both of you to working together to present this this training. It is going to be recorded, so people can actually also listen to this afterwards, because as a resource, I do think it's a much needed resource that people will benefit from, hopefully, for some time. So without much further ado, over to you, Tracey and Cathy, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Steffi. Yeah, so I'm gonna do the first bit. I'm going to introduce the session and do the first bit, and then I'm going to hand over to Cathy for the second bit, and then we're going to have questions at the end. But it is very much an informal session, so if you do have questions, I'm hoping that Cathy can keep an eye on the chat box whilst I'm talking, and vice versa, because obviously once we start sharing the slides, we won't be able to see that coming through. The way that we've done the session is that, well, if I get my slides up, I can show you exactly how we're running the session this morning. Might be a second. Okay. Can everyone see my slides? Not yet.
You're not in presenter mode yet.
Yes, I can.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, but not in presenter mode. Okay. Might be a second. Hopefully that's in presenter mode yet.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so sorry about that slight delay there. Okay, so the contents of this session is looking at formulating survey items. So the first bit is about how to word your questions, how to get those working well for you, because we've all experienced surveys, we've all been people that receive surveys, even written surveys, and sometimes the way that we do it, we really influences the data that we get back, and sometimes you can sort of live to regret the way that you've done your survey, or you might do someone else's survey and find that there's problems with it. So it's easy to sort of jump in and delve in and do it really quickly, or try to get it done, but actually the time you spend getting it right at the beginning is really well timed, really well spent time in the long run. We're then going to be looking at survey response items, so some tips to ensure you get the data that you need. So it's about how you formulate the responses that your participants can give you. And then you'll be looking at using psychometrics and using Qualtrics. And those last two sections are going to be, Cathy's going to be covering those two. And finally, we'll have questions at the end. So the focus is going to be primarily on closed questions in surveys that collect quantitative data. So we will talk briefly about qualitative data and how you can collect those in a survey, but the focus is really about using Qualtrics and about survey designs when it comes to gathering questions that give you quantitative data using closed questions. So that's not to say that we don't see the value of open questions and qualitative data techniques. Very much, they're very important, and very been much of some of the surveys that I've done, and I know that Cathy's done as well, and the ones that we've done together. The idea is about today is about making sure that your survey design works the best for you and what you need it to do. So you always often have to keep that survey question, that research question in mind at all times. What am I trying to achieve, and what will I get back from the data that will actually help me to answer this question? So you really need to keep that in the forefront of your mind. We're always going to sort of in these sessions assume that you've got your research question, you know what you need to achieve, and that you've already identified your data collection method, and that surveys is the most appropriate way to go. So we're not going to be saying, okay, should you be using a focus group, should you be using interviews, should you be using some other form of gathering your data. We are going to assume that survey is already the way to go for you. So we're going to look at formulating survey items, and I'm going to confess here that I've put my surveys together either through my PhD or my other research, or working on scholarship projects a couple of times as well. And I've always done it in a certain way, and I've always been fairly successful in what I've done. But there's been a moment of reflection in the last week or two in build up to this session for me to really think about, well, is my approach the right approach to do? I'm saying that it's successful, but what does the research tell me about what is the best way? So actually doing this session from my own professional development has been really good, because I've learned things from doing my own research about what makes surveys successful. So some of the hints and tips that I'm going to be presenting now are actually news to me, and actually the things that I'm going to be using moving forward as well. So everything that we're going to talk today is very much based on the research out there about the best way to conduct surveys. So rather than me going, oh, I think this is the best way, this is really research driven. And I think that gives you some comfort as well in knowing that. So the sort of rules that I've come across in the literature and that have been validated, to say, through research, is these are the best practice hints and tips. And then I'm going to break it down. I'm going to go into detail on each of these bullet points. So the first one is to avoid agree, disagree response options. So although it's about, obviously, we're going to talk about response options later, but when you're formulating your question, you need to think about your responses. And the literature suggests that actually agree, disagree response options are not the best way to go. And I'll talk about that why in a moment. Use questions with construct-specific response options. So think about what you're asking, what words you're using, and how they can be reflected in the response options so that they match and reinforce that construct. Only ask one question at a time. That seems really obvious. Why would you ask more than one question? But actually, lots of times, without realising it, we merge two different constructs together, or two different ideas that we need to separate out, because it just confuses our respondents. Use positive phrase language. Negative language confuses and throws people, and your data might be really mixed in terms of what you get back, and really confusing as to what you can extrapolate from it. And avoid reverse scored items. This last one was actually one of the real moments of reflection for me, because I've always been told, well, I was told when I was doing my PhD by my supervisors, oh, you need to include reverse scored items. And I'll talk about why in a moment that has been put forward. So it's something I've always done, and realised that actually it's probably not the best idea when you think about it. So we'll talk about that as well. So all of these are based on 40 years of research in the field. So this is not just one study that's been conducted in the last 10 years or something. This is continuous, and I'm going to talk about some of the literature and include some of the references, or all of the references, I should say, where I've brought this together. So I'm hoping that I've saved you some time by doing this, so you don't have to scrap around and find some of the literature to support the way that you may be conducting your surveys in the future. So this agree, disagree response formats, it may seem like a really good quick win. You're asking participants to agree, disagree, even on a scale, agree, disagree. Isn't that nice and simple for participants? They can go really quickly through your survey. The problem with this is that they do go really quickly through your survey, and they're not really paying attention. And the research does suggest that this means that they put in less effort, and because of that, they're not really thinking about those questions in detail. They're not really responding and contemplating if that is always the case. Do they agree all the time to that, or is this something that is more context dependent, more measured, and they need to reduce their agreement, things like that. So it's quite easy for participants to just think, oh, I'm just going to passively agree with all of this because maybe this is what they want me to do, maybe this is a little bit of demand characteristics, and so evidence suggests that if you do this, you would diminish your item quality. And there's a number of studies that have been conducted, because there was a bit of a wave of having lots of surveys going out with agree, disagree responses. So there's literature, obviously. Research was then conducted to see whether this was a good way of doing things. The second thing to think about is this construct-specific response items. And I think these are really, really useful, actually. And it's something that I've done more and more, because I found that it has been helpful in increasing my item quality. So if you wanted to ask the question, how much do you enjoy working for the Open University? You could just have a scale that said, not at all, a little bit, somewhat, and then go up. But actually, by using the word enjoy in each of the responses that they can choose, your respondents are getting reinforced of, this is the construct that I'm responding to. It's about enjoyment. I'm not going to miss it when I rush through that question. So you might read it quickly and say, oh, it's something about working for the OU. But the word enjoy is what you want them to focus in. So if you have that reinforced every time in each of the possible response items, you're really getting the message home. And it's more likely to have a higher validity. It's going to be more accurate to actually assess it that way. So you're reinforcing that construct. So that is far better than having an agree, disagree format. It's much better to have it like this. And I'll talk about, not necessarily saying that you might want your items listed as I've done here. I'm just trying to show that enjoy is being reinforced each time. We'll talk about layouts in a little while as well, and how important those can be. Ask one clear item at a time. So you might think to yourself, oh, okay, I'm doing a scholarship project and I want to find out about how associate lecturers deal with day schools. How do they find it? Something about that. And you might think, well, one of the things I want to explore is about questions. So how do associate lecturers feel about answering questions at day schools? So an efficient way of doing this would be just to have this question. When working with students at day schools, how skilled are you at asking and answering questions? And you might think that's efficient. I've asked both of those things together. And surely if you're asking or answering questions, it's all about questions, so it's fine. The problem you've got, and I've had this as a respondent to surveys, is that it makes me stop and then I go, well, actually, I think I'm quite good at answering questions, but I'm not that good at asking questions of participants. It doesn't come naturally to me. So of my students, I'll answer the questions, but I don't know how to elicit discussions or get their contributions. And that's something I'm not with. So how do I answer this question? Now, what a lot of participants will do in this situation is go in the middle. If in doubt, go in the middle of a scale. And then that way, I'm not going to affect the data too much. And it's sort of, well, I'm really good at one end and I'm not so good at another. So the middle seems the best way to go. And then what you end up with is lots of people giving middle responses. And you end up with, if it's a scale, when you find the average for that scale, you're going to find a midpoint. So it's going to tell you very little. So what you need to do is think about, well, what is it I want to know about? Do I want to know about both? I need to ask different questions to the participants. If I don't need to know about both, I just ask one. If there is some way of doing an overarching way of asking it, you could try and do that. I don't think in many cases you can do that very easily. And it's probably best avoided, but the literature says there are ways of doing that if you need to. So asking one clear item at a time is really, really important. And one way to with all these things is to make sure that you haven't accidentally done that as well, is to get people to take part as a pilot in your survey. So myself and Cathy, we wrote a survey recently for our scholarship project, and we sent it to a colleague and we said, could you just run through this and just note down any questions you've got, or anything that's not clear, or anything that you're a bit worried about. And it was really useful to get her feedback on that. And I would always say that as a minimum, that's what you should be doing to make sure, because sometimes you work with a survey so long, you don't spot the errors. And it's like what I said at the beginning of this presentation. I can read this presentation loads and loads of times and I won't spot errors. The minute I try and present it, and I bet I will do in a minute, I'll find an error in it. So it's really important to have somebody, fresh pair of eyes as well, not somebody that's looked at it several times. Try and give it in what you think is the final format to somebody who hasn't seen it before, who will dedicate the time to really look at it for you and be super critical reader. So even if they say things that you think, well, I don't think that's that important, it's better to get that. And the good thing is that if you are surveying students, for example, you've got to go through SRPP. SRPP people that review it, that look at it for you, and I used to do that, and Cathy's probably doing it, taking over from me as well, is that you've got fresh pair of eyes looking at it then as well. So that is really good, because I've pointed out errors to people before and they've been really appreciative, because it's better to find it then than it is to find it when your participants have responded and you notice, why have I got a score like that? Oh, it's because the question wasn't right. Try to use positive language all the time. It's very easy to slip in the sort of imperfects or the unsomething or the anti or the nots before the words. The problem with respondents, for them, they could really easily miss those couple of crucial letters, and then you've got half your participants are answering it one way because they've noticed that negative language, and another load that haven't, and then you end up with this washed down data that doesn't really tell you anything meaningfully. Cognitively, it's challenging as well. So Regna talks about this in theirs. If you think about, when people say to you, don't think of an elephant, the minute you say don't think of an elephant, you think of an elephant. So if you use the you're trying people not to think about that concept, they're going to think about that concept in the positive valenced way, and so that is a bit of an issue. And it can mean, as I say, errors in reading, considering and answering your items, particularly if only some of them are like that and others aren't, and it's really difficult. So if I was to ask a question, how inappropriate is it to call on an individual student, or in your opinion, I should say, in your opinion, how inappropriate is it to call on an individual student to answer a question using their microphone during an online tutorial? It would be better for me to say, in your opinion, how appropriate is it to call on an individual student? So that is taking it from the inappropriate. And it's also a little bit leading if you ask inappropriate, because you're suggesting maybe that it is inappropriate. So you have to really step back from each item and think to yourself, am I leading my respondents? Can this be misinterpreted? What's the worst case scenario? And deal with whatever you can deal with using this literature to help guide you through the do's and the don'ts. So this is the one that I was really surprised about. As I said before, I'd always been sort of taught and encouraged to use reverse items to sort of catch respondents out in a way. It's like you'll soon know if they're not paying attention, because you've switched one of the items around, and therefore if they were scoring quite highly on a number of items, measuring, I don't know, how much they enjoy working for the Open University, and then you say something that is a negative, they should go over that side of the scale. If they don't, then you've caught them out. The problem is that you don't know if that's what's happened. And when you think about this objectively, you might, some people, a bit like the one that I just said about negatively worded, some that will notice it, some that won't. What do you then do with that item? Because what you normally would do with a reverse scored item is then change it around so that it's positively valenced again. It's done that way round. So you change your scale in your, we would use SPSS or whatever your statistical package is if you're using it, or even in Excel, you would change the scoring. So if they scored 5 out of 7 on a scale, you would change it around to, that'd be 3 out of 7. So you would switch it like that. But imagine you're thinking about this in a practical sense. Imagine you're rating your experience of an online tutorial with a high score indicating a positive experience. A reverse item would be the opposite. So you might ask, did you feel frustrated at any point during the last online tutorial? So a high score would be a negative. It would be frustrated. But if all of your others are all about positive experiences, that's a reverse item one. So you'd need to reverse score it. But the intention is about realizing, telling your participants the need to focus. But in reality, as it says here in the research, items serve to diminish just the overall reliability of the scale. So it's actually doing you the harm. It's not actually working the way that you want it to. So avoid these reverse items, scored items. So that's something that I learned and won't be doing. I certainly won't be doing it anymore reading literature. So that's all about how you word your questions most effectively. That's all about how you put your items together. Now this is going to be more about the responses, and obviously those two things are tied together. They don't work in a vacuum, but there are some really important points, and again I learned a few things from this about the response items. So your questions are only good as the responses you allow your participants to give you, and it's really worth taking time to think, what do I want back? What is my data going to tell me from the responses I allow my participants to give? So if I'm doing closed responses, if I'm forcing them to give certain responses to me, they better be the ones that I want to then analyse and that tap into my research question. So will it have meaning? Will it help you to answer your question? So you need to think about things like the number of items, whether you're using scale or individual items, or a number of items collected together to measure a concept, or just one on its own. You need to think about the types of responses you're going to get them. Are you going to just get them to say yes or no? Or are you going to get them to work on a larger scale or labelled scale? Is it going to be vertical? Is it going to be horizontal or vertical in terms of the presentation? Personally, I've always used the graded rating scales because I think they really do measure sort of attitudes and strengths of feelings really well. But you have to be careful that you label them appropriately, that they are interpreted the same by all your participants. There's lack of subjectivity, because otherwise drawing meaningful conclusions is going to be really tricky. So the rules of the response item writing is choose an appropriate number, label all of them, balance the visual, numeric and conceptual midpoints, which sounds really, really sort of intellectually difficult, but actually it's really not. Visually separate the substantive from the non-substantive choices, which again sounds really complicated, but it's actually really easy. Format response options into one column or one row. These sounds like me being really, really pedantic, but actually I've seen the impact of confusing visualization and what it's done to people's willingness to complete the survey and accuracy of the data as well. The first and final refer to both ratings and ranking items, and the remaining refer to rating items only, which should be apparent when we go through these. So for your rating items, balance between enough options for participants to precisely, see, I knew I was going to find an error, so precisely represent their opinions, attitudes or behaviours, but few enough so that participants can clearly distinguish the meaning of each. So it's a real balancing act between enough options but not too many options, and clarity and versus subjectivity, etc. So this will depend on the topic and also your participants' cognitive understanding and the analysis that's planned. So what that means is, obviously, if you were using children and you had a survey with children, you're not going to want to give them lots of complicated options. Or if you have a patient sample where cognition is going to be difficult for them, again, you're going to keep it simple. For the average adult, you're probably not going to have to worry too much about that if that is your sample. The optimal number of options is between 5 and 7, with 4 deemed to be a little bit on the low side, and that's for cognitively able adults or averaged adults. And Weng does a good overview of that in their literature, in their survey. So for ranking items, this again is really important to think about the cognitive ability of participants. If you've got children and you said to them, I want you to rank, I don't know, give them a load of foods and say, rank your favourite to your least favourite, and you gave them like 20 foods and asked them to rank them, they would find that impossible to do so. And actually adults will probably find that quite tricky maybe as well. So you've got to think about your participants, what they're able to do. Actually, for most research purposes, probably ranking the top 3 or the top 5 is probably sufficient and what you need. But do remember, when you get those ranks back, how are you going to analyse them? What are you doing with that data? And think about what meaning you're going to be extrapolating from that, because rankings can be quite hard to deal with in terms of analysis sometimes. So have a think about that. And the more that you get them to rank, the more complicated that is going to be. So you do need to think about the interpretation when you get it back. So label all response items. So this is just, you know, if you was going to ask people how confident you are at using Adobe Connect in tutorials, this is basically the same way of doing it. Not at all confident. See how you've got the construct in there: slightly confident, moderately confident, quite confident, extremely confident. Somebody can go, okay, I think I'm moderately confident. Click, done. Somebody looking at the bottom one might think, okay, I don't know what that third one over is. My interpretation is that, okay, it's probably fairly confident, or it might be something else confident. And it's not as clear as the top one in terms of where you are. It's a lot easier to zone in when you've got them all labelled. And there was a time when people didn't label every response. It wasn't the norm as much. And I think it's a lot easier, especially if you're dealing with lots of different items, one after the other. You can look at the labels. They reinforce in your mind what your interpretation is, hopefully, and it prevents any subjectivity, because people could have different ways of interpreting the second, third and fourth boxes in that example where they're not all labelled. So balance the visual, numeric and meaning of the response item. So let's have a look at this one here. You've got poor, you've got fair, you've got good, you've got very good and excellent. Now, we could interpret it different ways in terms of where the midpoint is, depending on whether it's visual, whether it's numeric, and the meaning of the response options. Now, one way someone might say is, okay, I think it's between good and very good, because visually that's in the middle. That appears to be midway. So that's the midpoint. And someone else comes along and says, it's good because numerically it's the third option out of 5. If I do it on a number basis of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, good. Okay. So we've gone from being between good and very good to good. And then someone else comes along and says, well, it's fair, because fair is the meaning of the word fair is that it suggests neither good nor bad. So we haven't balanced those 3 different ways of looking at it and made them in agreement with one another, I should say. They have all extrapolated from this. If you're a visual person, you've gone one way. If you're a numeric person, you've gone another way. And if you're a meaning person, you've gone another way. So when you get the responses back, your validity of your data has gone right down because of that differences in interpretation. So make sure that the visual, numeric and the meaning are all talking the same thing. They're all going to give the same response. Okay. This again was something that I think I probably knew about, but hadn't really honed in on why it was important and how this can happen. So this was quite a good one for me, actually. This separating the substantive and the non-substantive, this is one of those that I've seen people do in the past, and actually I find it quite annoying that people do this. And what you want to do here is the not sure in this option isn't part of the scale. Okay, the scale is going from not at all helpful to not sure. The not in the first example, it's going to the not sure, but it should be going to not at all helpful to extremely helpful. That not sure is not part of that scale. So you need to visually separate it out. And you need to do that by leaving a gap or making it so it stands alone in some way. And because of what we said earlier about you want it all to be either in a column or a row, you want to keep this all on a row so they know that is all about the same thing. It's all about the same question, but actually there's an option of not sure, which is not part of that scale. If I'm working on the scale, I'm working on those bottom 5. Okay, so this was again supported by the research that it's important to visually separate them, because otherwise the not sure could be either missed, or it could be the option that people think is part of that scale. And I've seen this a few times in surveys myself, and it's not something I think is good practice. So make sure you separate them, I think. So whether participants are ranking or rating, it's a good idea with formatting to ask them to read either, as I said, from top to bottom or left to right. Don't mix it up. It gets very confusing for your participants. It is recommended that it should be a single row or a single column for the response options as well. So whether you're working, whatever way you're working, make sure, if possible, it's a single row or a single column. There is now more literature emerging that columns may be preferable, and this is because online surveys, when you do them on a smartphone, which lots of people are doing them on now, the portrait orientation works better for columns. So that's, again, emerging research. That research is actually quite old, but there's more of it coming down the line that suggests that is the case as well. So formatting and organising your survey. So you've got ask more important questions early, ensure that each item applies to every respondent, use scales rather than single items if it's appropriate though, format the layout consistently, and sensitive items at the end. So just to run through those, remember your early questions set the tone. The most important question is probably the first question. I've had surveys sent to me before now, and as soon as I see that first question, I'm making a judgment about whether I'm going to continue or not, and it can turn me right off doing the rest of them. So if you get it wrong, then you may lose participants, and your aim is to get a good response rate, remember. So the first question should be simple. It needs to apply to everybody that's answering it. We'll talk about how you can do branching to make sure that's the case. After that first question, it's easy to read and respond to, and it aligns the purpose of the survey. So if you're advertising it and doing your invitation and your consent form is all about, this survey is about improving online tutorials, and then suddenly the survey is asking them about how good do you think the module website is, you might be thinking, I wasn't really answering. I didn't think I was coming here to answer that. Thought I was doing something else. So it really all needs to align together. So I'm sure lots of you have started a survey and given up, or become a little bit haphazard in your responses because the survey's gone on and on and on. So you do need to think about that as well. Make sure all the questions are relevant. I've answered surveys before now and thought, this is not relevant. I answered this question this way, and why did it not branch me out so that I didn't have to look at all of these irrelevant materials? Because by the time you've worked out whether it's irrelevant, the question, you've been spending lots of time doing that. That frustrates your respondents, and frustrated respondents is not what you want to do. You want to come across professional, and that you've thought about every single question. So the cost of asking low relevant questions has higher consequences at the start of the survey, and so branching is much better strategy. So Cathy's going to show you how to do that on Qualtrics later. Really easy to do, and it makes it relevant for your participants. So if they say, if it says, have you ever attended an online tutorial, and the participant says no, they then should go off to a different, to the next set. If they say yes, there should be questions about that. So that's branching. So thinking of the question, how useful was the extra reading provided to help with you TMA 01, rather than having a not applicable option, ask them, did you access the extra reading? If they say no, then they go off somewhere else. And if it was yes, they add those questions. Using scales rather than single items, again, this is something that Cathy's probably going to talk to, well, I know she's going to talk to later. A scale is better at encompassing lots of different things within an experience or an attitude. It's better than a single item, particularly if that single item doesn't encapsulate the whole experience and attitudes. It may be longer for participants to complete, but actually sometimes participants want the opportunity to really drill down into what the problem was, if it was an experience of something, or how that attitude differs in different contexts, and you need to provide them with the options for that. So if I asked you, how interesting did you find this scholarship session on the surveys, I'd only be getting your idea of how interesting it was, not how useful, how applicable, how how engaging it was, all these other things that I could be asking that are missing. So you need to think about what the questions that you're asking and how they can tap into a scale. ensure that your layout is consistent and throughout the survey. There's nothing worse than having to be bounced about visually all over the place. You're more likely to get clearer, consistent data if it's consistent in your layout as well. Your participants are going to not struggle so much working their way through. Sometimes people, because they know that respondents can get a little bit bored, they try to cram it all in visually. They try to make it look smaller. The problem with that is that it can lead to confusion and actually make it harder for them to do. So you're not saving them time in the long run. So keep your formatting consistent, even if it makes it appear longer, because it will save them time. This one was another one that I learned about that I didn't know about. So place potentially sensitive items such as your demographics at the end of the survey. We've all got used to probably surveys where they ask you, you know, lots of things about yourself, like your age, maybe your ethnicity and other things like that right at the beginning. And actually, that is going in quite cold, isn't it? It's like, you know, it's like meeting someone for the first time, they suddenly ask you your age. It seems maybe quite rude. It'd be better if you actually warm your participants up with some questions about the topic, and then actually by the time you've sort of built the trust, your survey's gone really well, your participants feeling good, they get to the end, then they're more likely to feel like, well, this is the appropriate time to ask me those sort of sensitive pieces of information. And this is backed up by studies that say probably best to put them at the end. So again, this was new to me and something I'll be doing in the future. Things to consider that are just wider considerations. There are lots of off-the-shelf surveys that you can, you know, you might be doing your literature review and think, oh, I want to test the same thing as they are, just to maybe a bit different context. That's fine. You might want to take the off the shelf, but do make sure that it's relevant for your context and it's amended as appropriately. It is good sometimes to do that as well, because they would have done maybe some reliability analysis on it. They would have, you know, something that's been used before, it won't have the errors in it. They hopefully would have taken consideration of all these things that I've spoken to today. And you could maybe amend it and discard bits and pieces and use it for your own purposes. So it's not a bad option, but just don't do one of those things where people just take it and it doesn't work for your context. And that sometimes is a lack of confidence by people. They just think, oh, well, someone else has done it, it's got to be better than what I could do. But actually, it's not always the case. Always consider piloting. I would say pilot your test expert reviews on your surveys, even if it is one that you've picked off the shelf, because you've probably had to adapt it and you need to get a fresh pair of eyes to look at it for you. And as I say, SLPP can be great for that as well. So the references that have been dotted for this presentation, I've put into a reference list that goes on to 2 pages. So lots of great extra reading you can do, or references that you can use moving forward. I hope you found that useful. The slides will be available, as will the recording be as well. So I'm going to pass over to Cathy now, who's going to talk about her parts of it. So I think I've stopped sharing now, Cathy.
Tracey, thanks for that. So hopefully I'm just going to sort of expand on some of those elements. I'm saying this while I'm desperately trying to find my slides. I don't find Teams very intuitive. Right, can you see the slides in presentation mode?
I can, Cathy, yeah, it's looking good.
Super, thank you. So where Tracey's been talking about surveys and sort of maybe a very holistic way of collecting lots of information, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on psychometric tests, which to all intents and purposes may look exactly like a questionnaire, but I'm going to sort of tease out some of the differences and talk you through some of these. Now, I appreciate that not everyone here today is a psychologist, so my on button's not working. There we go. So I just sort of give you an overview of the difference between a survey and a psychometric test. So a psychometric test are designed to be very, very specific measures of specific behaviours or attributes, and they're designed in a very systematic way. So they are in and of themselves a tool that has been tested on samples and that have been shown to be reliable and valid. So the one that we're probably all aware of is an IQ test. So if we sort of think about IQ tests a little bit while I'm going through the next section, hopefully it will help clarify the difference between a survey and a psychometric test. So in a survey, the topics that you might want to cover might be quite broad. So you might ask tutors about their experiences of tutoring, how long they've been tutoring. So we've got some scale data. You might ask them for preferences of tutoring modes. So we might be asking them to rank some data. You might ask them for the most stressful element of being a tutor. So you might be getting a little bit of qualitative data there. So your topics can be very broad. And it's up to you what you need to include. Whereas a psychometric test is designed to pinpoint something absolutely specific, such as intelligence. Who are they produced by? Well, surveys are produced by you, the researcher, so you are going to bring together all of the information or the questions that are going to elicit the information that you are after. Whereas a psychometric test has been pre-designed. So if we were trying to find out the intelligence of tutors, although I couldn't imagine why we wouldn't do that, we would download an IQ test in order to give that to them to use. How many questions are answered? So in a survey, as many questions as you ask. It might be very, very brief, and it might be that you can capture everything in sort of under 10 questions. Whereas a psychometric test essentially is only answering one question. So if we give someone an intelligence test, it might have 40 questions in it, but essentially it's giving you one answer. What is their intelligence quotient? And the type of data that we can collect. So in a survey, we can collect all sorts of data. There might be some very clear scale data. There might be a little bit of qualitative that we can turn back into quantitative, and there might be some richer qualitative data in there. Whereas in a psychometric test, it's scale data and we're coming out with one number. So we may well use a psychometric test within a survey, but a psychometric test in itself is a pre-designed tool. So just to sort of expand on that for those of you that haven't come across psychometric tests before, our psychologists, we're more than happy sort of playing with psychometric tests, but I appreciate that's probably not across the board. So I just pinged in psychometric tests into the library search engine and just randomly pulled the titles of 5 together. But I just thought these just gave you a bit of a scattergun approach. And this is just looking at educational research. We can use psychometric tests for literally any behaviour you can think of, and probably some you haven't thought of. So here we've got some that are looking at staff working with technology, pretty appropriate for the Open University. Our subjective well-being, so our inner world, so eliciting responses to that. We can look at behavioural elements such as students working with statistics, always a fun topic, or how much they literally engage with their studies, or what are their experiences of assessment. So these are just 5 that ping to mind as I was just going through a list. And anything that you can think of, I can pretty much guarantee somewhere there is at least one psychometric test that has already been designed to test that thing. So why bother with psychometrics? Well, I could just ask the one question, and this really does follow on from what Tracey was saying, that I could just say, you know, on a scale of 1 to 7, where, you know, 1 is miserable and 7 is ecstatic, how happy are you at work? But essentially, is that going to give us enough information? It's sort of lacking detail. It might give a biased response, because today I might be, yes, this is the most fun, but yesterday might have been very stressful. So is it capturing all of the elements? Also, it might be that it might not capture all of your feelings. So it might be that I'm happy with my colleagues, or not happy with line managers, or not happy with today's tasks. So we need something that digs down into the data a little more deeply. So why use a psychometric test? So to me, there's a logic. If I asked you to go and measure the window so we can put some curtains up, you wouldn't first go out and devise a measuring device of your own making and then say, OK, I'm going to use that to measure a window. You just get a tape measure. So this is the point, that if we can use something that's already pre-prepared, it's just an efficient use of your time. Essentially, they should have been developed by experts, so it has validity underpinning it already. These experts should have validated their scales using large sample sizes, pulling out the items that don't work and focusing on the items that do work. So it should be very reliable. But the beauty for for this for me is how flexibly they can be used. You can take a psychometric and use it with the other data you might have collected around the survey to answer many questions. And I'm going to give you an example of how we can do that a little bit later on. Any questions so far before we move on to a worked example? I can't see the text box, the chat box. So if Tracey, if you can let me know if there's anything in there.
No, you're all good, Cathy.
All good. Right, so I'm working with just a random scale. The one I was going to use was really complicated. So I just Googled, well, through the library, a very, very quick scale. This is very loosely based on this scale, so please don't go back to this scale and say I've got it wrong. So this was a happiness with work scale, which just amused me in itself. So when we look at the actual scale that these researchers have put together, there were one set of questions that they would put together, which all linked to the concept of engagement. So sort of how we are interacting with our work. So they thought, well, that was an important element about the happiness of work. But that in itself doesn't capture all of what it might be to be happy at work. So what they also did was come up with quite a psychological construct, which was to be with this satisfaction, because we could be very engaged, but not necessarily very satisfied. So they introduced the job satisfaction scale. So even though their psychometric test is called happiness with work scale, what they've actually done is they've introduced subscales in order to measure that. And subscales are really useful because sometimes you might only want to know about how staff engage. You might not, for your piece of research, be interested in satisfaction, in which case you can extract just the engagement questions and use them within your work. Some psychometrics will just have the one scale, and that measures whatever that construct is. One I've just been using on academic motivation had 7 scales. So this was a highly complex piece of research, but it just broke things down into much more clearly defined elements of the construct. Something else to consider is these are the questions that after we went through all the validation process, these are the questions that actually were answering the overarching question most effectively. We call the questions items, so Tracey's talked about those, and it doesn't matter that they have more items for engagement than they have job satisfaction, because in actual fact, when it comes to the data analysis, we mean out each of these different subscales. So we get a value for your level of engagement and a value for your level of job satisfaction through meaning things out. So it doesn't matter that there are more questions in one than another. Part of this validation process, though, is that they have tested each of the question with respect to each item with each other item. And what they have found is that this is the best construct for whatever it is you're trying to measure. So although we may well tinker around the edges with some of the wording, you would not take out questions or items from each of the scales, because it's be like getting a tape measure and taking out any centimetre had the number 2 in it and squishing it all up, then we wouldn't have a valid measure. So you do include all of the questions from that subscale, although you might want to amend things. So the one I've just been doing on motivation, we were also looking at engagement. The original scale was developed for in-class sort of physical engagement in the classroom. So obviously we tinkered around the edges and reviewed it by putting things like online or while working online rather than working in the classroom. So it's fine to tinker around those edges, but you don't take out any of the items because they are like taking centimetres out of a measure. And when we put these all together, we would tend not to display them with all the engagement questions and all the job satisfaction questions. We would tend to distribute them sort of mixed throughout. And the idea here is that it increases some of that cognitive engagement, because it doesn't feel like I'm just asking lots of satisfaction questions. People can read one question, it's asking about one thing, and now it's asking about something else. So it's asking people to think more deeply about their answers. So controversially, on a lot of subscales, there will be reverse scores. So in here, you can see that there are 2. If the tests have been developed with reverse scores and they've been validated and standardized using that, again, I wouldn't tinker with them. They should have gone through all of those thought processes that Tracey was referring to earlier. So that's how they are put together, and these may well be integrated into a much bigger survey. And if we do that, then we can not only analyse, for example, the data that compares the two subscales. So we might find that those that are more engaged have higher levels of satisfaction by doing some correlational research. We can also take our scales and use them with other data you might have collected. So you might use your scales in comparison to another scale data such as age. So we might find that job satisfaction peaks at middle age and it's low when we start work and when we're getting towards retirement. So we can take the scales and use them with other numerical scales. Or we can use the scales and divide them down between other strata. So here we might divide out managers' responses from employees' responses and see, you know, are there differences in engagement and job satisfaction? So we can use these in many, many ways. So the research I've just been doing with motivation, we had 7 subscales for motivation. We had 3 subscales for engagement. So before we've done anything else, that's 21 different interactions. When we added to that age, gender, level of study, so 1, 2 or 3, and part-time and full-time, you can imagine the amount of different ways that our data set was huge, and probably we're going to get maybe 3 different articles out of that data set. Although that seems massive, the questionnaire that we actually sent out wasn't that massive, and it's just about how we use data cleverly and carefully. So any questions on psychometrics, please feel free to ask them now. I'm going to go on to Qualtrics otherwise, and we can ask some more at the end, but if there's anything now, please ask away.
Steffi's got her hand up.
Yeah, sorry to ask, but I mean, where can you find, you mentioned that there's sort of pre-designed surveys. Where can you find them?
So if you go into the library website, I will often try and put in the concept that I'm trying to study. Hopefully that will bring you up with some journal articles. So if it, so what I'm looking like for job satisfaction might be one of our search terms. My second search term would be psychometric or scale or inventory. So try and play around with these words. Hopefully it will bring you up with some journal articles of researchers that have published. If they haven't publish their scale within that article, you can either construct it because they often have the items listed in there, or I would then Google the name of the scale and write the word PDF at the end of it, and often that will find someone that has used it somewhere online and that you would have access to that.
And are there copyright protected at all?
So often in the journal articles, they will say, you know, please feel free to use a scale and please ensure that you reference us within that just to give credit. Sometimes they will say in the articles, so if you go right to the bottom, there will sometimes be a little bit at the bottom that says, you know, if anybody would like to use this scale, please email us and we'll send it over to you. I find actually accessing researchers for their scales, they're obviously very pleased that people are using them, again, as long as they're given credit for it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Any other thoughts or questions? I can't see hands up from my view. So
no, there's no hands up and there's no comments in the chat at the moment, Cathy.
Super. Right, so I don't know how many of you have tried using Qualtrics before. I'm sorry if you have, maybe you'll find out a few new things. I find Qualtrics, which is just an online platform for surveys, relatively self-explanatory, but hopefully maybe if you have used it, there might be a few tricks that I can show you today. But it is relatively straightforward, and if you do want to use it, if you email me, I can find out how to get you logged on with our Open University passwords. So it's pretty obvious in terms of getting started. You'll be given a page and just create a new project. I recommend you give your project a sensible name, because as you do more projects, you go, oh, which was that? Questionnaire 1 suddenly isn't making sense to me anymore. And I tend to start them from scratch. But if you are doing an adaptation of something you've done before, then sometimes you can actually play with that. So you might actually want to go back to an old survey and sort of play around the edges with it. So having started your new survey, you can, if you're doing it, as an OU project, go to the decorating roller icon, which I thought was interesting in itself. And that will allow you to select the Open University themes, and that will set it up with the logos. So it's all sort of nicely presented, ready for you to start adding your questions to. So I think it's always important to start with the title page, something that gives an outline of your research, so you can make sure that your respondents know what they're taking part in and who to contact if they've got any questions. So you can put your email address in there. So I would always start with the title page. And each time we're adding any new item, we always go to the add new question. And if we're adding a title page, it's not technically a question because we're just presenting information. So the drop down you want to click on is the text/graphic. And then you can type in some raw data, some raw information there. And it doesn't look very nice when you do that, but there's a lovely little button there called Rich Content Editor, and that will bring you to something that's very much like Word. So then you can start playing around. You can change the format, the font, the colors. You can insert pictures and images, so you can make that title page look very professional, quite striking, and bring the reader's attention to the things that are important. So it's sort of a nice introductory element. So that's how I finished formatting mine in the end. Not very exciting. Next thing to think about is actually, instead of having one massive linear survey, it's actually helpful to give the reader sort of stopping points. The next thing I would do is click on add a block. So it just gives us stopping off points and it will move to a fresh page. So I add blocks quite frequently each time I've finished doing a thing. It's almost like a paragraph in reading, that once I've finished dealing with that topic, I'm going to add a block and move on to the next one. And it just helps if people see this masses to scroll down through, they might get bored very quickly. And as Tracey's already highlighted, you don't want people getting bored quickly. So it's just nice stopping off points. So the next thing we would always need to do is to add in all of our ethical elements. And again, this can be done very simply by, again, adding a question. And if you scroll down to matrix table, I find this works very nicely. And when you click on the matrix table, it just supplies you with a sort of a standard block where it's got 3 scale points and 3 items. But that doesn't mean that you're stuck with that amount. And I'll show you how you can increase and mess around with those as we go through. So what I want to do is I want to have a section on taking part in the study. If I type in, just get my laser pen there. Oh. So if I type in yes here, what the program will automatically do, it will fill in the other options for you. So it predicts what you want. Now, obviously, it often over predicts. So I didn't want the maybe column. I just want people to say yes or no. Do they understand about taking part in the project? So if I click on the drop down box, I can remove that scale point and it'll just bring it down to my yes and my no. And what I've done next is just paste in each of my ethical statements that I want them to agree or indeed not agree with. So once I press that question is fine, this is how it looks to the respondents. So it's nice and neat, and they can agree or not agree to these various elements of taking part in the study. So that's just a nice, neat way of getting, obviously you'll have maybe 3 or 4 sections of that about how the information will be used and various other things. And again, I would block those. So one for taking part in the study, one about confidentiality and right to withdraw, etc. So next, moving on to branching questions, which Tracey's already referred to. Branching questions are a really efficient way of making, doing manipulation checks to make sure you've got the right people answering any of the questions, but also sending people to the right places within the questionnaire. So for this question, for this survey, I was only interested, say, in people that were in full-time employment. So just to make sure, because people often don't write the beginning blurb where you might have said it is important that you're in full-time employment. We all know that we skim over those things. So first thing we want to do is add a new question and go multiple choice, because this is where I'm going to identify. So I'm going to write my question, are you currently in full-time employment? And again, I typed in yes or no, and the program added a random other answer for me. Clearly, I didn't want that. So again, if you just click on the drop down and remove the choice, and it just leaves us with yes or no. The next thing I need to do is to add the branching element. So on the left-hand side of the page, you'll have a little tab that says question behavior. And what I'm interested in is skip logic. So what I want to say is, if you are currently full-time employed, excellent, you're going to carry on with the research. If you are not full-time employed, I don't want you on here. So I want to skip you to another question. Basically, I want to skip you out of here. So if I click on skip logic, I can now add my own logic. So if you are not in full-time employment, I want you to go to the end of the survey, because I don't really need you to answer any questions. So skip from this question to end of survey if no is selected. So you're just creating a little logic, and that will just take anyone that hasn't read that beginning blurb right to the end and out of it. What is useful is when you actually then do that within your draft of the survey, you can see what you've done as your skip question, but what the respondent actually sees when they fill it in is just something nice and neat like that. So you can see this helps you remember what you've done, but it doesn't complicate things when it comes to the respondent. So now what I want to do is to add my actual psychometric component into the survey. So add new question again, and matrix table, because we're working with scales here. So the matrix table is the most logical approach. And again, here is the standard element it gives you. But if you look to the left-hand side where all our action buttons are, we've got two action buttons. So the first one we're interested in is how many statements. So here it gives you a standard of 3. I just copy and paste in each statement. By the time I've copied statement 3 in, I've got to the end. If I've got maybe a psychometric test with 20 statements or items, I might split that into 2 pages, because that seems quite a lot to deal with all at once. So I might have go up to, so use my plus button to go up to 10, add those 10 statements, and then next I want to add my points. So on my original scale there were 7 points, so I want more than 3, so just click my plus button until I get 7, or however many you have decided. And what that will then give us is something that looks like that. If you type in strongly disagree or highly confident or whatever your first one is, again, the program will second guess what you want. Sometimes they will be exactly what you want. If they're not, you just overtype them. So you have that flexibility, but also you have got that preloaded content, which often does correspond with what you want. So I write my STEM statement here. Here are my items that I've copied and pasted in, and here are my 7 tick boxes for them to agree with. And then just press go, and if I've got more questions, I would just put them on the next page. The reason for that is as they go down, filling in each of these questions, it pushes the page up, and the strongly agrees and what have you disappear off the top. And they might have to come back and go, oh, which end was agree and which was disagree? So I find it easier just to make work in small packages of questions and then just move it on to different pages. So we also probably want some other information in here, so some demographic information. So again, I'd always start with a new question, and I think it's really helpful each time we move on to a different topic, like a different paragraph, what are we talking about? Introduce the next element of discussion. So I would go back to our text graphic box and just sort of introduce the topic. So here's a little section about you. So finally, we're nearly there. We'd just like to know a little bit more about you. And you could write more in there if you didn't, if the questions weren't essential for them to answer, or if you wanted them to focus on something specific. But I think it's nice to start each section with a little heading and what you want them to focus on. So for questions like age, so add new question, I would always go with text entry. So text entry allows the participant to free type. So hopefully, if you ask them how old are you, they will just free type 21 in there. Sometimes they will do it in words. That's fine. We can change that back to numbers. The reason I would ask them to free type is that if you give them sort of multiple choice of sort of 20 to 29, 30 to 39, blah, 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 it means that you are reducing down the usefulness of your data. When you're reporting maybe in a research article and you need to identify the average age of your respondents, you're not going to know the average age. You're going to say on average they were aged between 30 and 39, but you're not going to actually know how old they were. Also, if you're going to use age as an interesting point of analysis, if you've got them in age ranges, which often are a bit sort of arbitrary in themselves, you can't do any correlational research because you don't know their actual age. If you did have a reason latterly to put people in age categories, you can add that when you do the data analysis. So I would always take the finest type of data and then you can make it bulk entry later. So you can do that after the fact. But at least this way, it will give you their actual age. So you've got some real quantitative data to play with. Next up, if you were asking questions about gender, so you could ask how to identify. Again, what we have is the program will autofill elements. That's fine. You add, delete. You might think, oh, that is what I want. That's not what I want. So if it's one you don't want, you can just right click on the drop down and remove the item. You can overtype the item. So don't feel that you are pushed by whatever the program is giving you. And the one thing I will reiterate is the point that Tracey made earlier, is that once you have put this all together, especially if you've got a lot of skip items, the one that Tracey and I did, which was an evaluation essentially of 3 individual types of object, and the amount of skip items was intense, that you had to go away for a couple of days and come back to it. But things like that really need to be piloted. And when I say piloted, I don't mean just ask someone to do the questionnaire. Ask someone to do the questionnaire with a view to what is difficult, what don't they understand, was this question a little bit weird, did they understand it? Rather than just them answering it, write down a note. I didn't really know what you were asking by this question, or I thought what you were asking by this question was so and so, but I wasn't entirely sure. And that's the only way you're really going to find out if it works. And if you've got one thing that's a little bit muddy in the waters, you as sort of researchers might consider it one way, especially if you're asking something of students that look at something in an entirely different way. I remember doing one some years ago where I put something to do with higher education and further education, which as lecturers, these are terms we use all the time. And it turned out the students have got no idea the difference between higher and further education. If I had not piloted that on a little group of students first, I wouldn't have realised that they didn't understand that. So I cannot stress enough the importance of piloting it with the sorts of people that A, you want to fill it out, and B, that are going to be brave enough to tell you the absolute truth. So just opening up to questions. I've got some links at the end for the references, but not particularly vital at this stage. See if I can just find my way back to the world. Hello, is everyone still there?
Yes, Cathy. Well, I am still here anyway.
Good to know.
Yes, Cathy, still here. Thanks.
Hi, Cathy.
So any thoughts or questions on anything we've covered today? Stunned silence.
I find it was no, it was useful because when you were going through that, Cathy, I kind of had my questions up too and going, okay, all right. Oh, I forgot about that button and that idea. So it's just useful to be able to see it. And I think that's the part that, to see another survey and for you to go through that bit and what parts you put into. It's a bit of building to it. It's a bit fiddly. I've forgotten
Yeah,
how
and
fiddly.
sometimes ordering things, you might start with it in one order, it might just drag it in another order. And what I often do is if I'm asking, so there was one that I did some years ago on trainee teacher motivation. So we were asking trainee teachers, not motivation, but their sort of feelings about coming into the workplace. And what we did first of all was ask them what they were most concerned about as an open text box, and then after we did that we asked them some demographic questions just to distract them for a minute, and then we asked them the psychometric that we're using that was on the fears approaching the workplace. And it was really interesting because what we actually got from that qualitative box was their true first emotional feeling, and then we could link that to the psychometric feedback thereafter. So it's just sometimes the ordering of events allows you to get more effective data out of it. Hi, Steffi.
Giving me
Hi,
something to think about.
Sorry, I've just put a question in the chat box, but I don't know whether anyone else has done Qualtrics surveys more recently than I have with students, but in the past, what was really important in your student research project panel application, that you specified what kind of demographics you wanted to actually you're after, and then that was automatically provided, that data, and it's not generically provided. It's provided in a way, it was at least provided in a way that linked each individual response to the demographic part data. So you did not have to ask each student.
Okay.
So it was already in the system. It's like, so if the ID of the student immediately then, but you pulled out the data, but you do need, it was really important to be very specific about this at the application stage. So if you don't say it, they won't link it up. But I think that's very different. I think things might have changed. It's been a while, so it's worth exploring this. So you don't want to ask students again and again about demographic data if they actually have it in the system.
Super.
Yeah, so I think Elaine. But in that,
I think I used
demographic
JISC a long time ago. I can't remember. I think I felt Qualtrics looks nicer at the end. I don't know if JISC has upped its thematic game at all. And
I
also
did it with Qualtrics, so I think that's kind of. But at the time, it was actually at those times the stats team actually set up the Qualtrics survey. We did have to provide it with the questions. I should also say thank you so much. I just found these this so helpful. I mean, I've done quite a few surveys in the past, and I feel like I've learned so much. I've got like, oh, I wished I'd known this before. So in particular, I wasn't sure, like the agree and don't agree scales I've used quite a lot in the past, and but actually I was quite reassured after feeling rather foolish that I had, that actually in yours there were still some scales with agree and don't agree on there, but I will try and avoid them in future. If I have got sort of one other question, like for Tracey before, if that's okay, because you mentioned that the column design is better for mobile phone data. By that, I think you mean the top down. So if they're rather than
like that,
scale to the side.
Yeah, because I think it's just more about how it fits and visualizes into it. It may be something that isn't so problematic now because that study was done in 2004. But I know that lots of people do it on their phones, and sometimes there were struggles with the way that it then appears when it has to be in that format. But I try not to make it I always try to make it more sort of portrait and going down rather than wide as well as much as possible. But I think now that we're in a situation where it probably just defaults to fitting it into the portrait mode.
It might well do. And another small comment, like I've had.
Can I just come back on that for 1 second, Sophie, just to add to that? On Qualtrics, when a lot of the images I was showing was when we were in design mode. So there's a button at the top called preview, and when you click preview, it shows you what it looks like to the respondents, but it gives you two views. You've got if you were looking at it on a tablet and a laptop, but it also gives you the mobile phone view. And especially if you're doing research with students, they are so much more likely to be using the mobile phone. So you can get that really good feel, and you can actually, do the survey on both of the formats as a sort of a beta user, so you can get that whether it works first by using that preview view.
That's really helpful to know. I just kind of did, and just one last comment. Sorry, I'll shut up in a moment. But I think I found it for my surveys quite often useful if you had sort of quantitative questions on a scale of 1 to 5, or I enjoy or don't enjoy, whatever. Then follow them up with open questions like, do you have do you have any comments to add? Because I was really surprised how responsive students were, because sometimes they would say, I said I enjoyed this, but really what I meant, what I really enjoyed about this was XYZ, or I said I agree with this, but really there was an aspect I didn't quite agree with, but mostly, and I just found that quite surprising, actually, how much that function was used. But they could move on through the survey without answering the open questions. So if someone just wanted to do the quantitative ones and wanted to just quickly go through it, they could.
But sometimes people have found that those qualitative comments have meant that they've done a follow-up study from it, because the students have raised things they hadn't thought about, and then thought, oh, we should look into this more, and then done that. So I think that we've done that in our survey, didn't we, Cathy? We had the qualitative when we did the AL survey as well. So, and I think people sometimes just want their voice to be heard in the words that they choose to use. But then, like you say, they've got other Steffi that just want to go bish bash bosh, and that's fine too. So you sort of in a win-win situation by doing the qualitative option as well, I think.
And can you and in Qualtrics, can you specify which questions they have to answer and which ones they're just optional? Okay.
So some they will get stuck at. Some of them you can also, so for the psychometrics, you can also specify they only answer one per row. So instead of them like going agree and slightly agree, you can make sure they only answer one per row. If they have to answer every question, you can specify that. I would only say the every question if that every question was fundamental to a variable. So if they missed a question out of a psychometric, I could live with that. I'd rather they skip a question than stop the survey. And I think that's, whereas the first question about are you full-time employed or not, if that was fundamental, I would make that an essential. But it's always better to allow people to skip questions and get some data than nothing. But adding a little quali question at the end, we had so many people that said they didn't engage with the thing that we were investigating, and that box gave us a huge range of their explanations as to why they hadn't engaged, and things we'd not thought of. So real good value. And they tend not to write too much if it's already a questionnaire, but enough to give you a heads up on something. So I didn't see whose hand that was. Was it Heather's?
Yeah, and it's not my question. I just noticed that Ian had put a question in the chat box asking for advice about using surveys with our students. So I don't know if Ian, if maybe we want to expand upon that a bit.
Thanks so much for raising that. Yeah, we're running a FASSTEST project looking at critical thinking intervention with students over sort of 3 separate types of intervention. And we're looking at survey method as a way of assessing the level of impact. And I'm wondering what level of restrictions, and I know we should have looked into this first, we've kind of revised our thinking and come back to it and looked at survey. Are there any restrictions in issuing our students surveys that will be a part of this project? So it's sort of an overarching issue rather than sort of specifics about survey. But can I add to that? What a great session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll let Steffi might want to, do you want to come back onto the thing about restrictions?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, there are restrictions. You cannot just send a survey to students. Everything has to go to the Student Research Project Panel, and you have to apply to them for this. And ultimately, our FASSTEST project survey, project proposal forms are very much aligned with the kind of questions you would be asked by the Student Research Project Panel. And all of us are sitting on, like the FASSTEST team, most of the FASSTEST team are sitting on the project, on the Student Research Project Panel as well. So it's a team of colleagues looking at your application and giving you advice on survey design as well, and on the whole process. But and also you can't just approach any student. They are regulating which students you can actually approach. So there's a limit on the number of times that an individual students can be approached, and there's also a limit on some students have actually indicated as they're registered that they don't want to be approached for these kind of studies at all, so they are out of the system. So the university stats team knows that and has that information, and also holds all the demographic information about students, so they can handle that anonymously. So you know, it's a very, very regulated and well thought through process. And it's actually, while that feels like another hurdle, there are very, very good reasons for this. And I think, as Tracey said at the beginning, I think it's also very much a collegial process where you get actually other sets of eyes to look through your questions and helping you.
Stephanie, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. I guess that my sort of follow on from that is what's our next step, because we'd really like to have a chat with somebody about kind of where we are to help shape our thinking. We're at the very early stages at the moment of looking at how to assess this.
Which school are you in? Just sort of remind me. Sorry.
FASS. So
no, which school in FASS?
Psychology.
Psychology. So I think Cathy is your contact now to have a chat with and discuss these things, because the best thing is to talk to your scholarship lead in the first instance.
That's great. Thanks ever so much again, and thanks for a great session. Cathy, is that all right if I drop you an email? Thank you so much. Okay.
Any more thoughts or questions? If anybody is thinking of using Qualtrics at any point and gets stuck, please give me a shout. I don't know everything about it, but I know a man that does.
You're quite a whiz at it, Cathy.
And also the question types I showed you, they are not the only questions. So there's other interesting ways of asking questions as well, but these were just the introductory element. Sorry, somebody just put their hand up. Was that Chris?
Yes, Chris.
Hey, hi there. A really interesting session, and thank you. And I got thinking about the whole ways in which surveys can be used either to kind of like gather up evidence and information about what happens in the context, or with respect to like designing with testing a particular hypothesis. So a whole set of really interesting thoughts come into my mind. A question I would like to just broadly ask is, how does one address potential bias in either the design of surveys or any potential bias within psychometrics? Because obviously one's got to be kind of careful in the choice of surveys and kind of matching the instrument to the population that we are kind of using them with. Have you got any thoughts, pointers, tips, or guidance about how to think of bias or what it might mean? I'm kind of mindful of the debates surrounding IQ and what that means, and historically that's been quite problematic, and in terms of the using of certain types of questions and approaches to assess what that nebulous concept is. So I'm just like aware that it is a challenging and a tricky subject. Thank you.
Yeah, it certainly is, Chris, and actually I know it will resonate with Cathy as well in intelligence, IQ, etc. It's something that we actually have on our module in psychology on DE100, is about the controversies of IQ as a concept and measurement and all of those things. So definitely the case, and I think that sometimes we have to look back at the context and the history and understand that before just taking anything, I think, off the shelf, as it were, and using psychometrics, and even something concepts that are not like IQ, that are laden with potential sort of misogynistic or other sort of sat behind it, assumptions that are sat behind some of those psychometrics and some of those that are used. But I mean, Cathy, you're probably more knowledgeable about the use of psychometrics, but I would always say that look at the history, look at the context, and look at to see whether it's appropriate. And that's why I always worry that some people just take things off the shelf, and they really do need to be carefully considered, and particularly for, if it's something about student satisfaction with the universities and it's applied blankly from another university to our students, it may not be appropriate. There may be built-in assumptions about the demographics, the age of those students. So totally agree with you, Chris. Cathy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think things to look for. Obviously, sort of reading through the items yourself will give you some idea of whether you feel they are slanted in one way or another. I think also it's important to look in the article at how they define the construct that they appear to be measuring. You know, does that align with, because we might have something on satisfaction, but how maybe they're interpreting. So we looked at student engagement in another project. There were very different ways of interpreting engagement. In actual fact, even though we found one that looked like a really nice test, when we actually looked at what it was asking, wasn't quite the element of engagement. So make sure the construct aligns with what you're interested in. And another thing you can do is when you find the journal article that maybe has the reliability and validity sort of analysis in it, if you go on to a button on the search engine which will say other articles that have cited this article, and what that will show you is who else has been using this test? You know, is this being used by professionals in a meaningful way? So, you know, obviously the more footfall it's got, you know, the more sort of valid it's been deemed by those in the field. But yeah, some of this also is time dependent, isn't it? So if it's a really old psychometric, you think about some of the language that's been used in the past. Maybe it might be a good psychometric in that context, but you just need to bring the language up to date.
Yeah. You can soon see where sometimes surveys of psychometrics have been not used for the last 20 years or so. They were really
good
prolific.
Reason.
Yeah, there's a good reason they're now out of favour. Yeah, so that's a good point. Thanks for raising it, Chris. Really good. Yeah, and I think there's a comment from in the chat boxes about unconscious bias from Malia as well, about the course there, about, you know, what you could be bringing into your surveys without intention. And Sinead said about SLPP sort of giving some really good feedback as well. So it is quite good to have fresh eyes. And people from different disciplines will be looking at it as well, which will offer different perspectives, which I've always found really useful as well in that group.
I should perhaps also say that in the induction materials, also responding again to Ian, and there's actually in the induction materials that you will have been sent at the beginning of a project, as to there's information about how you know, the student research project panel and the different application processes you need to go through. It's also a data protection issue, so it's not just don't just need to go through the SRPP, you also need to go and register it with data protection if you're approaching students. You also, depending on what kind of questions you're asking, it is a good idea, well, it is a good idea anyway to register it, the project at least, with the Human Research Ethics Committee, so you can publish your findings afterwards. If you haven't done that, it's really difficult to publish afterwards. Very rarely do the Human Research Ethics Committee ask more questions afterwards, but actually I think that's only fair. If you it depends on the kind of questions you want to ask students, then they might sort of open, you know, they might ask you more questions. While that feels quite cumbersome, it is actually all there to improve the process and actually make sure that staff and students are safe, and make sure that you've got the best project possible. And I think
it is a good protection, isn't it? Because as well, like you say, if you suddenly want to publish it, or if you want to, you know, or there was a concern, then you know that it's gone through the correct processes. And I mean, myself and Cathy went through HREC, and we weren't sure whether we needed to for our scholarship project, because it was based on ALs and it was just evaluation of something. And we did it, and they said you don't need to. And that in itself was reassuring for us that we did the paperwork, and we didn't feel like it was a waste of time, because we felt good that we had this statement that we didn't need HREC and that we could use that in publications as well. So if in doubt, I would always say go to HREC anyway, because it's that reassurance and confidence.
Yeah, and if you haven't got the approval of the ethics committee, it is and a publish. I have been asked in the past as well. Then if you haven't got it, it's really difficult to get it in hindsight. It's quite often impossible.
Yeah.
So it's much better to go through this as a formality, almost like it's not a formality. You need to ask those questions anyway. You need to ask yourself those questions.
Yeah.
You know, that, you know, it's really important to do it. But those information will certainly have been sent certainly to the project leads at the beginning when the project is approved.
Yeah.
So
and Michelle's comment
coming
there
back to us if you have any further questions about it, because it's important.
Yeah. And Michelle said here about going through HREC and SRPP, endorsing that, because it's really good process. It's a good learning process, and it's collaborative. It's not meant to be catching anybody out or anything like that. It's really just working together as a community in scholarship.
Yeah, and we've been trying also to align those processes much more closely in the last couple of years, because previously they were quite separate. So there's a lot of effort has gone into making the process more smooth. So it doesn't feel like you're having the different parts of the university that are not talking to each other.
Yeah. And it is good just to look at your research from a different way rather than just, I want data. It's good to go, okay, no, hold on, let's think about the other people involved in this process.
Yeah.
Ethics should be at the beginning, really, aren't there? I think it's all like, I think it's part of keeping yourself safe as well. So yeah. Anyway, thank you both, Tracey and Cathy. I think that was so helpful. As I said, I learned a lot as well. I just found this really, really useful, and thank you. And I hope the recording will also be useful to lots of colleagues afterwards. So very, very helpful. And as you said, you'll share the slides afterwards as well. And I think we'll put them on our website as well with the event recording. So I think that's much appreciated. Thank you so much for preparing the session and for holding it. I know, Tracey, you have not been feeling well, so I'm amazed how lively and enthusiastic you managed to be throughout the session.
Maybe this is the cure, Tracey.
It's a cold and flu Nurofen, if anyone wants it. Not that I'm pushing drugs or anything, but you know, like that's what's got me through. So I'm going to go and have a lay down in a minute. But thanks everybody for attending and for your contributions as well. I've really enjoyed it. And as you say, Steffi, I learned things as well by doing the research for this and actually finding out the best practice out there. And I think the slides would be useful because the references on there as well that people can also track down and pursue hopefully after the session. And yeah, great. And Cathy has volunteered to be the Qualtrics expert now, so that's recorded as well.
No, but it's great. I just thought it was just so useful. So thank you so much to both of you. Fantastic.
Thanks.